tonight, I wanted to continue with the shir, which I started on the last year, which is really very important. And that is the sufferings of the Mashiach ben Yosef, right? Which is really a very important idea. And tonight I wanted to go further with it. I already explained a lot in the last shir. You know, what it is, the concept of Sifrei Haramchal, those who bear pain and suffering, right, in order to help the Jews expiate their sins and do the tikkun. And they do need, obviously, they need people to take up the slack. And I brought the medrash about Mashiach ben Yosef and so on, you know. I just wanted to, however, make a comment on something which I think people are aware of, but it's very important to say, every day something seems to go on in America that's newsworthy. I mean, really, you know, it's like every day is shocking. You know, there was a second attempt on Trump, on his life and so on, you know, and it's not going to stop. What does all this mean, really? We've never seen such incredible animosity, visceral hatred of a man. And I've mentioned many times that this is really satanic, because what we are watching, and we are really in the midst of that, and you have to just remember that the messianic process, the first stage of the messianic process, is the elimination of evil. You see, and that is part of the good, that evil is eliminated. And the part that we really want is the change toward the good, you know, toward that which is, you know, desirable and that which is a blessing, you see. So the first part of that stage one is really the elimination of evil. So what the Rebbeinu Shem has done lately, anyway, and that's, I mentioned the whole concept of the window closing. He said, look, you know, I don't want people to complain to me. Imagine that, well, you know, why didn't you give us a chance to do good and so on? So Rebbeinu Shem says, in a certain way, I want to remove all your claims. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you to do whatever you want. I will not interfere with what you want to do, even evil. Because I want the world to see, once and for all, that if I allow mankind to do what it wants to do, this is the evil, which is almost incomprehensible. This is the evil that they will do. And that's really what we're watching. We are watching mankind allowed to do whatever it wants to do. And God will not interfere, basically, or impede that action. Because what he is demonstrating, and I've mentioned other things that, you know, what God gets out of this, but one of the things is to remove the complaint. Well, if you would have let us do what we wanted to do, you know, we would have been good and so on, we would have benefited society and so on. So God says, okay, I will not interfere in whatever you want to do. And this is what's happening. So mankind is able to do, the evil people can do whatever they want, basically, obviously up to a certain point. And God is going to demonstrate, look how far they've come. Look how evil they are. All they're interested is what? Is self-aggrandizement, power, pleasure. That's all they're interested in. And they'll be willing to step on other people, millions of people, in order to do that. So God will once and for all have demonstrated, right, the evil of mankind when it is allowed to do. And if not for the fact that God has interfered over all the centuries with the ability of man to do what he wants to do, finalize his evil, this world would have been destroyed a long time ago. And this is what we see, you know. Give them a break and they will destroy you. And we're not talking about one or two people, you know. We are talking about millions and millions of people that don't care of the suffering of other people, you know, and so on, you know. And that's really what we're looking at. God is removing the claim that mankind will have against him. And that's it. It's a very important concept. It's because in the end, God says, look, I'm fair. You have a claim, I'll show you. I'm not going to argue with you. I will show you what man is capable of. In fact, what's interesting about it is at the end of Noach, or whatever, you know, or the end of Bereshis, actually, you know, it says, you know, I'm going to destroy man. God says that, right? Ki yetzelev adam rak ra minu urav. Man is evil. You know, so God is already testifying what mankind is capable of. And this is the demonstration, okay, of what man is capable of. That's an important idea. And therefore God is vindicated in terms of what he has done. That's important. So what we are witnessing is, and this happens, by the way, only at the end. So what we are witnessing, make no mistake, is the final battle of good versus evil. That's what you're watching. And that's why we are witnessing miracles. And I mentioned the miracles of both Trump and Harris, the miracles. That here's a woman, you know, who won every election that she's ever been in. And not only that, she has violated democratic principles by being a candidate without a single vote being cast. This is unheard of in American history. And that's the miracle of Harris and so on. And not only that, everybody knows she's completely disqualified to be president. I mean, it's astounding. But people don't care. The fact that they have caused untold misery. You know, we don't even measure, except if you experience it yourself, what the misery is when you're barely making a living and you have to go into a grocery store, a supermarket, and you take a look at the prices, you know, you can faint because you realize you don't have the money to make it through the week. But 2/3 of America live from paycheck to paycheck. And I heard that 50% of America don't have more than $500 savings. Could you imagine not to have more than $500 savings? If God forbid there was an emergency, they'd be finished. That's where America is at. Yet people are still willing to vote for Harris. You know, so even if you don't care about yourself, what about your neighbor? What about your friend? What about your fellow citizens? Don't you have Rahmanas on them? I'm not even talking about the fentanyl, the sex slavery, you know, the slavery of men and women in Mexico, what's going on down there. We don't even comprehend what is going on down there. Where's the Rahmanas for these people? And so on, you know. So there's an enormous amount of America in pain, right? You know, they may not be collapsing in front of you, but they are in pain because they can't make it. And one of the worst anxieties is that you can't make it. Everybody knows what that is. You see, nobody cares. So we're not talking about 5 or 10,000 people. We're talking about 80 million people or 70 million people or whatever that are willing to vote for a continuation of this unbelievable suffering. And on the other side, God is saving Trump miraculously. And we know there's even a second attempt in his life, which means that there are now going to be many attempts on his life, you see. In any case, you can't even describe the judgment or the din Torah, the judgment that is happening in heaven, because the Satan knows that if Trump wins, he's finished, because America will radically change for the good. And he knows that he's finished if that's the case. And even in Israel, we witness that they are now destroying their enemies and so on. So therefore, what you're looking at basically is satanic hatred of Trump. Because the first stage of the Mashiach, the Messiah, is to destroy evil. And then and only then can good now begin to proliferate and dominate. Anyway, that's just a statement of the overall climate or atmosphere of really what's happening in the world today. And of course, it's obvious, as far as I'm concerned, that the good will prevail and evil will be destroyed. And the messianic process will begin. That will be a turnaround. Anyway, okay. Now, let me just continue. This year should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Ruvain and Yeshaya ben Yisrael, Binyamin Wolf, Ben Tzvi Baruch ben Binyamin Wolf, and the family should only see bracha and blessing and so on. And also I want to dedicate the shir to a refuah shlema for Esther Liba Bas Chaya Yafa. She should have a total refuah shlema. Okay. In any case, I had mentioned something the last year, and I want to elaborate on it because it's very pivotal and in many ways very, what's the word for it? Startling. We know, and I want, because this is very important to understand what the Mashiach ben Yosef goes through, but it's not just the Mashiach ben Yosef. It is many people that are subject to this phenomenon. What is it? We know that there's a thing called the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, right? And there's the Eitz Hadas Teivara, and there's the tree of life, and then there's a tree of life, or rather the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We know that. What are these trees really? What the Moshe is saying, a very, very important idea, that there are two realities that I'm going to place you in. I'm going to place you in one. It is your choice to change the reality of the first into the second. If you do, you will suffer severe consequences, but more important, the avodah, the task that you will be assigned, will change. In either case, there will be olam haba, but it's going to be different. What are the two realities? One reality is the Eitz HaChaim. What does that mean? Now, what's important to remember is the creation of the Satan, the angel of death. That's really what he is, okay? Or the angel that tempts man to sin is necessary for the Bria. Why? Because if you only had a neshama and you did not have any kind of temptation, then you would never be inclined. You would never have a tendency or a proclivity to sin. Why should you? You see, you would just go about your job and do good. Because the neshama, which is a whole different shir, the Yetzer Hara, there is no Yetzer Hara really. The neshama is the Yetzer Hara. You don't need a Yetzer Hara if you have a neshama. But since you have a neshama, you do need a Yetzer Hara. Why? But you don't need a Yetzer Tov because you have that already. That is your neshama. And your neshama automatically wants to do good because it is a part of God. So if God did not create the Yetzer Hara, right, which is a Satan, you would never sin because you're not driven to sin. You're not driven in any of the urges, right, that you want to do what you want to do and defy the will of God. Therefore, the creation of the world requires a Yetzer Hara. And the Yetzer Hara is the one who tries to tempt you to sin. And therefore, mankind lives with a struggle to do good or evil. You see, people think, well, what do we need a Yetzer Hara? You don't understand. Without a Yetzer Hara, you would never be challenged to do bad. So what's the point? God wants you to be challenged, do good, right, with free will, and then earn your reward in the future world, right? And you earn Olam Haba, the future world, by your own efforts. That's why he has to create the Yetzer Hara. But there's a difference in your relationship with the Yetzer Hara. That was the choice. There are two realities to that. The Eitz Chaim meant, and that's how the world started, with the Eitz Chaim, which means that is the reality that the Yetzer Hara is not part of your being. The world is not part of the domain of the Yetzer Hara, the evil tempter. In other words, the Satan had no relationship really to the physical world, the world of Geshem. He existed, right, and he could tempt you, and his mouthpiece was the Nachash, the snake. But he could not invade you internally and give you drives where you now want to do what you want to do and sin. You see? That's the world of the Eitz HaChaim. And therefore your job was, right, to be tempted, because that has to be, you must be challenged. But you had no internal drives. There was no Yetzer Hara at all in the world itself. It was a world of physicality, and that was it. However, there's the Yetzer Hara of the Eitz HaChaim, not the Eitz HaChaim, excuse me, the Eitz HaDas, Tov v'Ra. You see, that if you eat from that tree, then what you will be doing is introducing the Yetzer Hara into your reality, where he becomes part of your physical body. That's a whole different situation, you see, because then you have a Yetzer Hara, right, an evil tempter, but he's now part of your goof. You see, you now have a world of what's called Geshem, physicality, and Zoyamah. Zoyamah is the force or the projection, you know, of the Yetzer Hara into the physical world. You see, that's the second reality. So you still have Yetzer Hara, right? But he's now part of you. So there's certain things that changed. Once he became part of you, he's no longer outside of you trying to tempt you to sin. He's now giving you drives and urges to sin. All the drives and urges that you can imagine to defy God and to sin, to do what you want to do and so on, right? Without taking God into account that he's the source of your life and the direction and so on, right? He is now part of you. Now, first thing, what happens to the world? Well, the Yetzer Hara is fundamentally an entity that destroys, that decomposes living things, the forces, and also inorganic things. How does it manifest? Because what happened was that since the Yetzer Hara now invades your world, right, you decompose. Ultimately, that is what death is. Death is nothing more than the decomposition of living material. So now all things decompose. You see, the ability of physical matter to decompose is the manifestation of the Yetzer Hara in the physical world. But besides that, this world essentially is energy. And we know that energy dissipates. It's called entropy. That is also the Yetzer Hara. Where a system that has energy, it will dissipate. It will weaken automatically. In fact, that's the second law of thermodynamics. That's also the Yetzer Hara. It's interesting that the second law of thermodynamics is the Yetzer Hara, right? So before that, where a man would live forever, wasn't just a man, nothing would die. There's no such thing as death or any kind of deterioration or decomposition. And there's no entropy, you see. But once Adam ate from the tree, he introduced the Yetzer Hara a new reality, where the Yetzer Hara now invades you through the force called the Zayama, you see, and therefore he now exercises his properties, which is Zayama, and that decomposes living matter and also destroys energy, you see, which is bad. You see, that's the manifestation of the Satan in our world. Very important idea. But there's something else that changed as a result of that. As long as the Satan was on the outside, you see, so he could not share anything that you were privy to at all. But once the Satan became part of you, then all of a sudden things changed. Now what did change is before Adam ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what was his job? Well, the reality was there was no Yetzer Hara in him. So his job was basically ignore the advice of the Satan, which Chava should have done. She should have ignored the advice, the satanic advice, to defy God by eating from that tree. That's all. But now that the Yetzer Hara has entered your physical body, the avodah, the service, is no longer to ignore the advice, right? Because he's part of you. What you have to do is expel the Satan, right? You got to get rid of him. In other words, you have to kill him. You see? You have to expel the Satan from the physical body. It's a different avodah. But the question is, wait a minute, what do you mean expel the Satan? How? You see, so what the Rebbeinu Shem did, you see how the avodah, the service, the task, changed because the reality changed. So the Rebbeinu Shem now has to change reality to accommodate that task. What do you do? So until Adam ate from the tree, when the Yetzer Hara was outside the physical universe, or whatever, wherever he was, right? And your job was to ignore him, right? Then each thing lives and continues to exist because God issues forth, and they're the spheres, a divine flow of spiritual energy that creates and maintains the existence of every iota, every molecule, atom, has to be sustained, created and sustained by God from nanosecond to nanosecond, from instant to instant. If God would cease to think about this, everything would instantly evaporate. Instantly. You see, because in order to exist, they have to have a continuous flow of divine or spiritual energy. You see. But in order to fulfill the second job, which is the second reality, where you now must expel the Satan and destroy evil from within you, right? He has to change that reality. So what he did is he took the flow of energy, divine energy, that sustains the Satan, because even a Malach has to have that energy. And certainly man, all things have to have that energy. And he cut, sort of like the energy goes through a cable that goes directly into the Satan. So the Rebbeinu Shem came over to the Satan and cut the cable, which instantly means that the flow of energy stops to the Satan. So before the Satan evaporates, whatever, he takes the edge of the cable of the Satan and he connects it to man, you see. So it's incredible. Now all mankind, actually mankind has what? Has a cable that comes down through which the divine energy flows. One part goes into mankind, Adam. The other part goes into the Satan. So it comes out that they're both vying for the same energy because they both need it to exist. What determines the flow? And the answer is man, not the Satan. What does that mean? If mankind does the will of God, so the flow goes to him of divine energy, and he exists continuously and flourishes tremendously. And what happens to the Satan? The energy goes to man and not the Satan, you see. So the Satan grows weak. In fact, the whole side of evil grows weak, and he begins to falter. And eventually, if all mankind takes away the energy from the Satan, then he dies, which means he's expelled from the human reality, from the entire physical universe. You see? That's how he does it. But since he's part of you, right, and you're bringing down the energy, what happens if you sin? So the energy that mankind was supposed to get now goes to the Satan, because he's part of you. You see, if it goes to the Satan, then mankind begins to diminish, to falter, you see. And if mankind continuously sins, then mankind is doomed to die, because he needs that energy. The Satan grows in might because he's getting this incredible energy. This is called Yenika, nourishing, that the Satan is able to nourish and therefore survive and flourish, right? With the energy that mankind should have gotten had he done the mitzvahs, had he done the will of God. Therefore, mankind now has the ability, because of this new setup, to destroy the Satan. You see what's going on? So it comes out that all mankind is now connected to his own internal Satan. And what we're looking at is reciprocity, reciprocal. If man does the will of God, then the seesaw goes up and the Satan goes down. If mankind sins, then the seesaw goes down his side and the Satan goes up. And there are all kinds of repercussions as a result. So the Satan has to be unique from your energy. That's how mankind can do it, you see. And this is all because of sin of Adam. Before that, that wasn't the job. It was just to ignore the Satan. You didn't have to expel him, but now you have to expel him. And therefore God changed the reality. What reality? The reality of the relationship of the Satan to you. This is a critical relationship that mankind now has. Now, I'll jump ahead, because it used to be Adam that had this ability, a relationship with the Satan. And not only that, then it was 2,000 years of mankind. All of them were supposed to do the tikkun, which means they had this relationship with the Satan. But ever since they sinned, and I had mentioned this many times before, God took away the ability of mankind and he gave it to the Jews. He gave it to Avram Avinu, Abraham, to do this. So now only the Jews have this relationship with the Satan. A goy does not have this relationship. A goy can destroy his own muscle, but a Jew can destroy creation itself, because if they diminish, the whole creation diminishes with them. You see, a goy can destroy his own mazel, his own good fortune. A Jew can destroy the world. That's the difference. I spoke about this many times before. So the relationship between a Jew and the Satan is called milchama, combat. You see, that is the relationship. Very important idea, because it defines the history of what is going on between mankind and the Satan. You see, very important concept. Okay, great. Now, what is the relationship we now have with the Satan? Well, there are three things. One, that the Satan is able to try to get us to sin externally. What does externally mean? Nations of the world, they try to destroy us. They try to interfere with our ability to learn Torah. I mean, how many times did the nations of the world say you cannot learn Torah, we'll kill you. You cannot have bris milah, we'll kill you. You cannot observe Shabbos. I mean, this is a repeated offense that the nations of the world continuously do. You see? So that's a Satan, satanic, trying to get us to sin. The second relationship we have with the Satan is not only to be tempted to sin externally, but internally. We have our own urges. We have our needs, our drives. We have a drive to sin, right? There's so many different ways to be a Baal Gaiva, right? Or to engage in promiscuous behavior, or to engage in behavior which clearly makes us feel as if we are God or supreme, and so on, without having to go through all the areas of sinning and so on. So internally, we have to face our own Satan, our own Yetzer Hara, you see. So we have this going on. And what is interesting is that the Avos fought the Satan, right? Because that's the job now, you see. What is the job, really? So one job, which is very important, and I once mentioned this many times before, we have to take back all the divine energy, which I will call now the sparks of holiness, the sparks of divine energy. We have to take it back from the Satan, because he's accumulated an unbelievable amount from the sins of mankind and the Jewish people, you see? So part of our avodah is to take back the energy, you see. The second job is to bring down the rest of the sparks, right, from above, and change the world, which I had mentioned, zikuch, which is to purify physicality and begin to change it into a spiritual reality, right? So those are the two necessary services, tasks that a Jew has to do, you see? And therefore, the way you take it back, right, basically is to withstand one of the ways is how? Well, one of the ways of, very important ways is to do the mitzvahs, and that brings down energy. But the way we take back the energy from the Satan is we either suffer Yisurin, so we have a kapara, an atonement, and when you have a kapara, the energy has to be given back to you, or you withstand the temptations of the Satan, and as a result of that, right, he gets weak and he has to give you back the energy. In any case, so this is basically what is going on. You see, the concept that there are three. Now, it's interesting that you see the Avos, they majored in different ways. Avram Avinu, right? Who did he oppose? He opposed Nimrod. He opposed the entire world. You see? So who did he fight? He fought the Satan of Avodah Zarah, which is external to him. You see? So he fought the Satan, the Yetzer Hara of the outside world. You see, which is the, as I mentioned, the first relationship or level of relationship. Then Yitzchak fought also the Yetzer Hara, but Yitzchak is interesting. Yitzchak did not fight the world, except by Avimelech, but he didn't go around like Avram Avinu and invite everybody in. He wasn't into the Hachnas Ochim that Avram Avinu. You see, Yitzchak wasn't to what's called self-improvement. He fought his own internal urges and drives. You see, he had a Kovish Ezer Gibor, who is strong, and Yitzchak is part of Gvura. A Kovish as Yitzroi, who subdues, right, his Yetzer Hara. So Yitzchak's specialty was to subdue his own Yetzer Hara internally, not externally. You see, that's why Yitzchak was commanded basically never to leave Eretz Yisrael, but to work on himself. You see? And then you had, of course, the third, or as I will get into it, which is basically both, were Yaakov Avinu, whose job was to bring down Kedusha, and therefore he was a Yoshev Holam, a dweller of tents where he learned Torah all day. And Esav, who was an Ish Sodeh, Esav's job was to go into the field and change people. In other words, to defy the Satan and try to bring back people, right, to the will of God. Believe it or not, that's what his job was, to fight the Satan. You see, okay, that's very nice. So we see that the Avos were actually involved in the three different relationships that we have with the Satan after the sin of Adam HaRishon. You see, now, once we understand this, we can now understand Mashiach ben Yosef. Mashiach ben Yosef was very interesting. What did he do? I mentioned the Medrash last time, right? Where he said, where God said that your people will not be able to make it because they have too many sins and they cannot expiate them. There's not enough time in this world to do that. Not everybody, but whatever a sizable proportion. So the Mashiach ben Yosef said, I will take on, right, all the suffering needed to take out the sparks of holiness from the Satan, which is the task of the Jews, you see? And therefore, to do the tikkun that they should have done. And if I take on their suffering, I mentioned, that I can expiate for these people that would not get the future world. Fine. But you know what Mashiach ben Yosef really did? He created a new form. What did I say? A new form of relationship with the Satan. And that is the klipa itself. What does that mean? That means he said the following. My relationship with the Satan, and therefore to take back the Satan, where is the arena of the war? Well, it's either external, like I said, right? Or it's internal, right? That's like saying, okay, he's either external, where I live in a city and I'm being attacked by an army of another city, another country. That's external. Or I live in a neighborhood, and guess what? The Satan lives in a house right next to mine, but it doesn't live in my house, you see? So what the Mashiach ben Yosef said is the relationship that I will now have with the Satan, because that's the way I can do it in a shorter amount of time, is the Satan is moving into my house. What is that? That means the Mashiach ben Yosef is now going into or living together with in the same apartment as the Satan himself. You see, that's called he entered the klipa itself. He didn't have that before. Well, the neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef enters the klipa itself and fights the Satan within his own boundaries. Do you have any idea what that is? What does that mean? That means he now becomes subject to the temptations because his shirish is connected, his root soul is connected to the root soul of the Satan. That means his drive becomes super. Right? He's no longer an average person, Well, the Satan lives a couple of houses down. Okay, he's trying to tempt me to sin. But wait a minute, the guy moved into my house. Wow, you know what that did to my drives? It made it unbelievably difficult to survive. Because I now have a super Satan. That's called entering the klipa itself. That's what the Mashiach ben Yosef apparently did. And therefore, when he resists the Satan, he can draw out an enormous amount of sparks because his root is connected to the root of the Satan. Now, we don't even know what that means. What does it mean to be subject to the urges and drives of the Satan himself? You see, we don't know. You see, that's what the Mashiach ben Yosef did. And that automatically increases exponentially the sufferings of the Mashiach ben Yosef. And therefore, he is subject to tremendous chet and tumah. Right. All of a sudden, his world changes. Because now the Satan has a whole different access to him that he has with the normal people. And we will see that. Now, where do we see this? Well, let's take a look. We will see now, why is it that many events that are connected with the messianic process all seem to have the appearance of sin? Let's take a look. Cain, right? Why was there Cain and Hevel? Same idea. You see, Hevel was in the job in a certain sense. He was toiv. So his job was more like the Eitz HaChaim, you see, which is more Mashiach ben David. But Cain's job was, right, that's Hevel. Cain's job was Mashiach ben Yosef. And in fact, the Rabbi Moshe says that, La Pesach Chatos Roivetz, sin, right, stands at your door. What does that mean, stands at your door? Right? And then he says, you can dominate over it. You could win. What is the Rabbi Moshe saying? That you have a phenomenal Yetzer Hara. You see, this whole concept of being subject to the Satan himself in an abnormal way is now being given to a host of people, you see, to help. And Cain is in the parsha of Mashiach ben Yosef. And therefore the Moshe says that sin couches at your door. He's right at your entrance. What does that mean? Is he outside? No, he's inside. But thank God he's only at the entrance. He's not in the Satan. The Pesach Chatas Revetz is a Satan. So the Moshe says, by the way, sin is inside you, right? In a super way. You see, not totally, thank God. It's surface. But even if it's surface, it's in the klipa, as they say. You see, that was Cain's nisayon. Unfortunately, he failed. You see? And the Moshe is already warning him. Chatos is sin. That's where the Satan is, you see? Then we come to what? We come to Lot, right? What is Lot about? Okay, he runs away from Sodom, right? And the Malach destroys Sodom and Amorah and so on, right? Right? Now the two daughters of Lot, now remember Lot was the, it was Avram Avinu was the uncle of Lot and so on, nephew, whatever. And Lot himself, the daughters of Lot, thought that they were the only ones alive because they saw the whole place burning down. So they decided, and this is in the Torah, that they will live with their father, incest. Now they thought the reason why they did it, because there's no other, everybody is dead. Okay, fine. But whatever it was incest. So even if they had a reason to legitimatize the incest, that's what it was. So the Torah says they got him drunk. One daughter lived with him one night, another daughter lived with him the second night. Whatever it was, excuse me, why was this necessary? Because the Moshe because from these two daughters came two nations, Ammon and Moav. You see? And what was the importance of Ammon and Moav? Right? From Moav came Rus, the mother of the Mashiach, and from Ammon came Naamah, who married Shlomo, who's also the mother of the messianic figures. Because the Rosh wanted to slip down the neshamas of Rus and Naamah with the appearance of Chet. You see? Because the Rosh is now involved in all this kind of, the appearance of sin. But it's interesting, it's not only to use sin and tumah as a way of a part of the messianic process, but he also does it to fool the Satan. Where the Satan says, well, nothing good can come out of these guys, right? And meanwhile, the Rebbe Hashem slipped down in the Neshama of Rus and Naamah, you see. But they're not the only ones. I mentioned who, right? Yaakov and Esav. And here's where you see what Mashiach ben Yosef did. Yaakov, in the uterus of Rivka, he wanted to come out and jump out to worship in the synagogue, in a shul, right? Esav wanted to worship an Avodah Zarah, which is, when you think about it, really incredible, right? But wait a minute, how can an embryo want to jump out to worship Avodah Zarah? Because you are now looking at somebody's neshama who is in the klipa, who is now connected root to the Satan, right? Therefore, we now see Esav clearly as a person that is now, in a certain sense, wedded to the Satan, where they live in the same apartment. You see? So he had what's called a super Yetzer Hara. And I spoke about this, that Esav still could have beat the Satan. And I mentioned the whole concept of kibbut of, whatever, without going through the whole thing again, and so on. But that's where you begin to see the real concept of being tied root to root with a satanic figure. You see, that's what Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, Esav was in that parsha of Mashiach ben Yosef, right? His job was to resist the incredible temptations of the Satan, which is demonstrated by him as an embryo wanting to worship idols. That was his tendency. That shows his proclivities, his possibilities and so on, right? He was connected, like the Ramchal says, the shirish of Esav as an Ov was connected to the shirish of the Satan as the chief of evil, to destroy the Satan, to withstand the temptations in the world, and to be able to subdue him and take back all the sparks. See, Esav is the proof of the whole concept of a new relationship with the Satan. You see, where you now live in the guy's, or rather he lives in your house, but root to root, you see. So that's the beginning. Then we find, this continues. Now I mentioned also, okay, Esav failed. He became a Russia, we know, at 15 years old. So Yaakov Avinu had to take over the job, right? Okay, so therefore Yaakov now had to go to Lavan, the house of Lavan, right? He could not learn Torah anymore. He had to go to the house of Lavan to again fight the Satan at a root cause, you see. But where do you really find that? You find it by the fight with the Malach, right? He remains behind to get some kalim, that he left behind. And all of a sudden he sees this lonely guy, and that lonely guy or that individual fights him. That's the famous fight. With who? So Rashi says, who was this guy? That was the Malach of Esav, who is the Satan. So it comes out, here's where Yaakov now has super urges to sin, right? You see? Because he had to do this in order to replicate the job of Esav. But what was the sin? Or what was the Yetzer Hara that he was experiencing? Because the fact that he was struggling with the Satan meant, right? And that's what it was. It wasn't, and which is interesting, if you look at the Sipurno, he wasn't fighting with a man, even though it says, Vayeovek ish imoi, and a man fought with him. It was really the Satan disguised as an ish, because when the Satan enters your mind as the Yetzer Hara, then we call him an ish, a man. But really he was fighting with his Yetzer Hara. What was the fight? The answer is Gaiva. Very interesting. And we find this from a Medrash. Why? Because imagine what a guy would feel. He beat Esav, right? And then he beats Lavan. He remains at Tzaddik by Esav, remains at Tzaddik by Lavan, right? And now he's about to meet Esav. And not only that, but he has Baka Tzoin. He brought down the neshama of Mashiach ben David, which is Yehuda, Mashiach ben Yosef, which is Yosef, and he has the 12 Shvatim. You have any idea how proud he was? He basically set up the whole structure of the Bria, the future of the entire Bria of the 12 Shvatim to do the Tikkun, and the neshama of Mashiach ben David, and the neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef. He brought him down. So the Satan said, do you know who you are? You're phenomenal. You're a godlike figure. So the Yetzer Hara of Yaakov wasn't Taiva, which would appear to be by Esav. It was Gaiva. And that makes sense, because the main concept of Yaakov is Anivus. Katoiti mikol hachasodim, it says. I am nothing compared to all the chesed you did. Right? His major tzidkus was his Anivus. So his now Yetzer Hara, after all these accomplishments, now became Gaiva. Unbelievable. But not just Gaiva. Wow, I'm phenomenal. right? I'm godlike. That's how bad it was. And it was super, you see? And that's what the Satan wanted to do. It was to get him to sin with gaiva, but not taiva, because he doesn't have that yetzer of taiva. You see? Where do you see this? It's incredible. Did Yaakov win? Mostly, but not totally. He did emphasize a certain amount of gaiva. How do we know this? The Medrash. Because when he left the man on the other side of the river, whatever, right? And then he went back to his, after he met Yosef and all that, it says that he went and he built a mizbeach, and he calls it Kael, God, the God of Israel, Elokei Yisrael. So the Medrash says, well, who's this Kael? It just said he built a mizbeach dedicated to Elokei Yisrael, the God of Israel. Who's Kael? So the Kael is Yaakov himself. He referred to himself as a god. That's how, for that minute of haughtiness, we don't know. It's hard. We can't say Yaakov was a Baal Gaiva. Of course not. So we don't really understand what that means. But the Medrash does indicate that he faltered, however long, that he had an inappropriate measure of gaiva, of the accomplishments that he did, you see, which he should not have had. It's a Medrash Rabbah, which is amazing, you see. So, and that's, by the way, because of that faltering, you now understand how did the Malach hit him in the hip. That means he had to fail in some way, because if you fail, he can hit you. But if you are successful totally, he can't touch you. So the question is, how did he hit him in the hip? You ever wonder? And the answer is because that was the gaiva that he fought. To move away, no, it's not me. It's all the chesed of the Ribbono Shel Olam. You see? But because he faltered for whatever, we don't really understand in what way that was. The Satan was able to hit him in the hip. And the hip is what? Right? Is the foundation of a man. You see? And so on. It's the Yisoid. He was able to hit him there because Yaakov did falter for a drop. And therefore, that was a Pesach of the Satan to say, you see, he deserves to be injured somewhat. And he was able to do that. You see, now everything makes sense. I see. But why did he go through this? Because he had to do the job of Esav, which is to experience super drive, a super nisayon, you see. Great. Now who takes over? Yosef. But wait a minute. Why? I mentioned Yaakov cannot take over Esav's job totally because he doesn't have the characteristics of Esav. So Yosef had it, right? And therefore, if Yosef took over the job of Esav, what do we know now? That he has to be afflicted with a super nisayon, like Esav. Where did this happen? That's the interesting concept. Where do we find Yosef being hit with a super yetzer hara? And it was a miracle that he survived. Let me tell you something. Right. You see. And he also faltered, by the way. In any case, where? The Torah is meramis that in an incredible way, where it was. Guess where it would be? By Potiphar's wife. Right. That wasn't merely a seduction. That was a seduction with an unbelievable yetzer hara to be with this woman. It was not normal. Where does the Torah meramis that? In an incredible way. Here's what it says by Potiphar's wife when she came to Yosef and said, please be with me. Right? What do you mean? I can't do that. You're a man's wife and so on. Right? So the Torah, how does it describe it? It's incredible. It says like this. Vayovei habayso lasis melachtoi. And Yosef, who's the manager of Potiphar's house, right? He went to the house to do his job. So apisoid, to do what job? To do the job of Esav. Because guess what's going to happen? You are now going to be afflicted with a super taiva. The Torah is warning us, beremez, what's about to happen. And therefore, look what it says. And it says, okay, so he goes into the house, and then it says, v'ein ish, and there was no man, me anshe habayis, from the household, shom baboyis. There was nobody there. But wait a minute, what do you mean there was no man of the household there? Right? It should have just said, right, and there's no man there in the house. What do you mean there was no man of the household? Who cares? It should just said, ve'ein ish, shom baboyis. Right? And there was no man there, right, in the house. But it doesn't say that. It says there was no man be'anshe habayis, from the household, from the men of the house, shom baboyis. What is that? That's the remez. Wait a minute. What's the diuk? What do we do? What's the implication? Well, there was no man of the house. You're right. There in the house. But there was another man, not of the household. That's the implication. If you tell me there was no man of the household there, all right, that means there's no man of the household. But the implication is, but wait a minute, maybe there's another man, not of the household. What man? That man was the Satan, Vayeovek ish imoy, and a man fought with him. That's who was there. The Torah is alluding to the fact that there was nobody there from the household, but there was another being there that is also called Ish. Who is that? The one he fought with on the land, Vayeovek ish imoy. And who did I say that Ish was? The Satan himself. Well, what does that mean? That means his drive to be with Fatifa's wife was super. That's what it was, abnormal. Because he had to experience, like I said, what does it mean to be in the klipa? Because that's what Esav was, you see? And he had this unbelievable drive. We don't even understand what that means, you know. But the interesting thing about it is, I mentioned Yehuda, he also experienced this, right? But that's because God took away his free will. I mentioned this last year. But God allowed Yosef to remain with the free will. You see, because God wanted Yehuda to live with Tamar to bring the Mashiach. Because Peretz is the forerunner of Mashiach ben David. There's another Tamar where he thought he was living with some prostitute. Yeah, but why do that? Why bring the neshama of Peretz, the forerunner of Mashiach ben David, in a manner of Tamar, of the appearance of Chet, right? Because the messianic neshama has to come down, right, through Tamar, you see, because that is its relationship being in the klipa. In any case, but Yosef, by and large, did not stay with her, obviously. And because of that, he remained on the Merkava, the divine chariot, and so on. But he did falter. He faltered, right. He did release whatever, and whatever, and you know, it's what it says in the Torah or the Medrash, whatever. In order to avoid, he was about to collapse, you know, into sinning with her. That's how great the Yetzer was. So he took his fingers and he dug it into the ground, causing enormous pain, and he was able to stop himself. If not, forget about it. You see, that was where he was subject to the Yetzer Hara, full-blown. Klipa means the Yetzer Hara's arena, you see. When you think it's raining, but Yosef is the neshama of Mashiach ben Yosef. Can you imagine Mashiach ben Yosef going through this? Right. Well, that's what it means when you take on the nisyonis of the Jewish people. So that's Yosef HaTzadik. So look what we're looking at. We're looking at Cain, right? We're looking at Loit, Rus, gives birth to Rus through incest. We're looking at Yehuda with Tamar, right? We're looking at Yaakov, right? We're looking at Esav. We're looking at Yosef. Hey, 6 stories. All of them have the appearance of Tamar and Chet. You see, isn't that amazing? And all of them are tied to the Mashiach. It's amazing. Who's next? You know, we can begin to think. Oh, well, guess who's next, is Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Egypt is known as a place, Shtufei Zima. Egypt was an unbelievable promiscuous place, right? Well, as it is, the climate meant that you walked around with much less clothing than most people, because Egypt is basically desert, you see? Not only that, Egypt was a promiscuous place. It was Moli Zima. That's what Chazal say. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, where was he born? He was born basically in Paro's palace. In fact, he grew up in Paro's palace, right? Could you imagine walking around Paro's palace? How they're dressed, what their values are, the Avodah Zarah, and he's got to maintain himself? You have an idea how difficult that is? He's not with Amram and Yocheved, learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. He is with Paroi and his entourage and his palace. So he's got to survive all that tumah, zima, you see, taiva, living there. And then he has to run away. And for 26 years, not 26, 54 years, he ran away when he was 26, right? Until he got to the Sneh, or until he got to, Yisrael and so on. He had no Jews. So he's alone and becomes whatever, the king of Ethiopia, the general of Ethiopia. What do you think, these people are tzaddikim? They're all tumah, all values. It's all promiscuous, everything. And he's got to be in that society. Who's going to last in that society? You see? So it's all filled with chet and tumah and so on. Why? Because Moshe Rabbeinu is Mashiach ben Yosef. That's why, you see. And then we come to the story of David. I once told the story of David. What the story was really, because there was a big question. There was a big question about David HaMelech. Who is this guy? Why? Because there was a question. Are you allowed to marry a Moav? No. Because it says Moavi cannot come into the congregation of God. What about a woman Moaviyah? So they had to settle that. Because it says Moav, Moavi, and so not Moavis. Anyway, so what's his name, Yishai said to himself, am I allowed, my mother is Rus, she's a Moaviyah. I don't know if Boaz was allowed to marry my great-grandmother, right? If that's the case, that means I am not allowed to marry a Jewess. So therefore he separated, because he didn't know that answer, right? He separated from his wife. You see? But his wife said, what are you talking about? For whatever reason, she felt, no, you're allowed to marry a woman Moavis, and so on. Anyway, she arranged with a mistress, or what's called a Pelegesh, that instead of this Pelegesh being with her husband, Ishai, she wants to be with him that night, whatever. So he comes out living with his wife, and he doesn't know it's his wife. He thought it was his mistress, right? Fine, okay. Guess what? 3 months later, his wife is pregnant. Now he knows that he's separated from his wife. Ergo, as they say in logic, it can only mean that she was mizana tachtov. She had relations with somebody else. She's an adulteress, which is an unbelievable embarrassment to the family. You see, who was the kid that his wife gave birth to? David. So as far as they were concerned, David was basically a mamzer. He was a product of an illicit relationship because his wife lived with somebody else. So for 17 years, they thought David HaMelech was a mamzer. Talk about tumah, talk about zima, talk about sin, right? And that's why when Shmuel HaNavi came to the house of Yishai, and the Rosh said, go to his house, because in his house, one of his kids is going to be the king of Israel. Asa came, right? And he asked Yishai, well, where's your family? Wow, the Shmuel HaNavi, greatest Navi in Israel. Right? So he lines up his kids. And the first one was Eliyav, who looked great. So the Baruch Shem said, no, he's not the guy. Whatever. And then he goes through all the kids. None of them were. So he says, I don't understand. The Baruch Shem said that one of your kids is the Melech Yisrael. Do you have anybody else? He said, there we have. We have a guy who's my son, who's out tending the flock. Well, why didn't you bring him here? He can't be the Melech Yisrael. The guy's a mamza. Or whatever he told Shmuel HaNavi. You know, a mamza can't be a Melech Yisrael. So Shmuel HaNavi says, listen, I don't know what's going on here, but call him in. Called him in, right? They called him in, David HaMelech from the shepherd, from the flock, right? And he walks into the door, and all of a sudden, the anointing oil in the hand of Shmuel HaNavi to anoint the king, right, flies out of his hand right onto the head of David HaMelech. We talk about a miracle, right? And talk about, you know, a confirmation of who the king of Israel is. So the question is, what do you mean? David HaMelech is the Mashiach ben David. He's the forerunner. I mean, who is greater than David HaMelech? He's the Mashiach ben David. Yet for 17 years, the family of David HaMelech thought he was a mamza. Illegitimate kid. Why did God do that? Because the Mashiach is always involved, since he's in the entry of Tumah, he's in the Klippa. He's always involved in the appearance of Chet, you see. And it's also a way to fool the Satan, because the Satan says, well, if he's in my grasp, forget about him, I don't have to worry about him. Whatever, getting into that and so on, you know. But take a look, and then we have another Mashiach. Most people don't know this person was supposed to be Mashiach. Shimshon HaGibor was the Mashiach ben Yosef. Actually, what's called Mashiach ben Dun, because Dun also has a Messiah, without getting into that and so on. And what was he involved in? Well, he was involved with the Plishtim, Delilah, right? Excuse me, what are you doing living with a guy, even though he converted her and so on, you know? What are you doing there? You know, what kind of a yeshiva guy? And Shimshon was a Navi. He was a Nazir. But he was also a Navi. He had Ruach HaKodesh when he was born. You see, he wasn't an ordinary person. I mean, his strength was legendary. I mean, Samson, I mean, that's legendary, right? But he wasn't just a guy. He was a Navi. Not only that, his strength was completely abnormal. I mean, he killed 2,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey. You have any idea what kind of strength you have to have in your arm? You know, in those days, you couldn't fire a gun. You had to kill him with your hand. It's a handwork. You know how many times you have to move your arm to kill people? And he killed 2,000 of them. And this man was extraordinary. And so on, you know. And he's Mashiach. What's he doing with the Pelishtim? And so on, you know. Okay, without getting into... But again, it's the appearance of Chet, of Tumah, and so on. What do we see therefore? We see now what the Yisurin of Mashiach ben Yosef is. Last week I had mentioned what the Yisurin is basically, is what? That he can't learn. Now you understand why. Why can't he learn? I quoted the Neflois HaYehudi, right? He forgets every day. Why? Because he's in the Klippa. And the Satan denies him access to the Torah in an abnormal way. In a super way. That's why. So that's his first Yisurin, suffering. His other Yisurin, right, is tremendous drives, which is what Yosef has. You see? But the real Yisurin, and this is what in many ways is terrible. You know, it's one thing to have drives to do sin. That's one thing. It's one thing to have tremendous drives to sin. Tremendous taiva, you see, to sin with whoever and so on, right? But what the Yisurin of Mashiach ben Yosef is much worse than that. You know why? Because not only does he have an abnormal drive to sin, he has an abnormal drive to be a kodesh. That's the killer. Could you imagine, like I said, a person that has the neshama of an unbelievable kodesh, holy man, and he has the neshama of an unbelievable Baltaiva or Russia. How do you exist in the same body? You have an idea what kind of challenge that is? What kind of a conflict that is? To be subject to the drives and the Yetzer Hara in the klipa of both. The Kedusha is mamish akin to an unbelievable tzaddik. The dvekus, the drive to be a tzaddik, and then the drive to commit sins. And he's got to go through this. Right. That's the Yisurin of the Mashiach ben Yosef. And now you understand what it means. You see, there's a very important pasuk in Eov. It says, Umiyitein Torah mitame. Who can give tahara, purity, from tumah? Who's the only one? How can you extract purity from tumah, from defilement? Only God can do that. You see, that's exactly refers to the Mashiach ben Yosef. He takes tahara because he's in the klipa. So even though he's in tumah, but he can come out being tahor. And now you understand one of the secrets of the Parah Aduma. The Parah Aduma is who? It's a parah, which is a symbol of Yosef. But it's not Duma, it's red. And what do we know about the Parah Aduma? Nobody understands how it works. Because if you sprinkle the Parah Aduma on somebody who has a defilement of a dead body, he becomes tahor. But the one who's sprinkled becomes tameh. How can that be? How can the very same process be metame and mitar at the same instant? You see? And the answer is because that's tahara coming from tumah. Who is the Parah Aduma? The Parah Aduma is Mashiach ben Yosef, and he's red. He's tumah. Yet from him you can become tahor. So the one who uses the Mashiach ben Yosef himself is red. He's tumah. But from him comes unbelievable tahara, right? Kedusha for the Jewish people. Now you understand. And where do you see this? Because in the Gemara it says, right? Here's what it says in the Gemara, that I think it was Rabbi Yehuda ben Levi, if I recall. He asked Eliyahu Hanavi, where is Mashiach? So he said, he's at Pischei Roimi. He's at the gates of Rome. What do you mean the gates of Rome? Gates, just like Cain, the Satan was at the gates of La Pesach, at the entrance. That means that the Mashiach is at the gates of Rome. Rome is Edom. He's Esav, right? He's the Klippa. And the Mashiach is at the gates, means inside the Klippa, right? That's the remez of where the Mashiach is located, in the actual arena of the Satan himself, in his, where he moved into your hotel room, and he now lives with you. Could you imagine what that does to your Kedusha? What that does to you? You see? So we now understand that not only is the inability to learn Torah, right? Then there's the fact that the Mashiach ben Yosef, the real one, is associated with chet. You see, in many ways an abnormal nature. You see? Because the Mashiach ben Yosef was mechadish, an unbelievable new avodah, a new service. That it's not enough to be subject, to be today together with, I live in one house and the Satan lives in another house. That's where we and the Satan live together, where the Satan has now become internal to the universe. That's one thing, and I mentioned what that means. But to go into the house of the Satan, my soul is connected to his soul, that's a different type of avodah. It's called, the avodah in Tocha Klipa, you see, and so on. But one of the incredible ideas which originated with that Mashiach ben Yosef is, and God said that because he knew Mashiach ben Yosef is not going to survive. Not when you are connected like that. Yosef didn't survive. Yosef almost fell. Yaakov fell. And Yosef did, and Yosef fell. In the end, they fall, because do we have any idea what it means to have an abnormal drive? No, we don't. So what does the Rebbe Shem say? And it's necessary. I will go into the klipa with you. And that's Shchinta B'Galusa. You see. Why? Because the Rebbe Shem has to be together with the neshama of Mashiach ben Yosef, or he won't be able to survive. You see. And that's a new concept called Shchinta B'Galusa. The Shechina, the divine presence, is in the klipa, bikalusa, which is golus. You see, what does that mean? Of course, God is not contaminated at all. But what it means is that God gave the Satan the permission to dampen his energy, the divine Shekhinah energy, right? That the Satan can block the energy of the divine presence. That has tremendous repercussions. And that satisfies judgment. You see? So of course the Ramchal could wipe out the whole Bria in a nanosecond, right? But he did this because to help the Mashiach himself. And by the way, in a certain way, once the Shekhinah goes into the klipa, into the territory of the Satan, you see, and the Ramchal does it, the Shekhinah does it voluntarily, then you know, segments of Klal Yisrael are also in there. Tzaddikim are in the klipa. That's a whole other understanding and so on and so forth. But we now understand what Mashiach ben Yosef asked for. He introduced a whole different methodology. It's not enough whether the Satan is now in creation, you see, or in the world, and part of the world, the Zayam and so on, where you now become part of his arena, part of his environment. You're in his house, you see, because if you resist and you fight, then you draw out so much more energy, and that will ultimately allow the Jews. And besides that, the suffering that you have to go through to survive in that environment, right, will atone for the Jewish people. So now we have a begin to understand, you see, but the truth is what will happen as a result. And I have to tell you this, even though it's a little late, but I don't want to skip this. What will happen in the end? Okay, Sefer Yeshaya, Perek Nun Beis, 52, right? Pasuk Yud Dalet. Listen to this, and I'm going to read it in English, okay? And so on. But look it up. Behold, this is Yeshaya Novi. Okay. Behold, my servant will succeed. Who is my servant? Who is the servant? So the R Moshe that he will succeed. Who? Yeshaya is now talking about the redemption. He'll succeed, my servant. Who's God's servant? So there are a number of Mefoshim that say it means the Jewish people. They will succeed. They've been in exile, now they succeed. But the Targum Yonasan says it refers to Malka Mashiach, the Mashiach, not the Jewish people. And the Ramban says this, and so on. And the Zohar says this, right? So now let's use the word Mashiach, because that's what they say. Who is Yonasan ben Uziel? Who is this man? Believe it or not, Yonasan ben Uziel was phenomenal. The Gemara says that Hillel had 80 students. 80. The greatest one was Yonasan ben Uziel. Targum Yonasan ben Uziel. He was so great in Kedusha that when he was learning, and if a bird flew over his head on top of the roof, it was instantly burnt to death from the Kedusha, right? And that was the greatest of his Hillel students. Who was the lowest? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. But anyway, this begins to tell you something about Yonasan ben Uziel. Second thing, which is even more incredible, is the Gemara says that Yonasan ben Uziel wrote the Targum. Right? Fine. But he's writing the Targum on Breshis, on Chumash. Then starts to write on Nach. He gets to Daniel, right? Where the Malach says to Daniel when the Mashiach is going to come. And guess what? He knows, Yonasan ben Uziel knows when the Mashiach is coming. So he begins to write that out in Daniel. So all of a sudden the earth shook. Whatever that meant, an earthquake or whatever, it shook. And all of a sudden there was a divine voice that said, who is about to reveal my secret to the Bria? You're not allowed to reveal when the Mashiach. So Yonasan ben Uziel stood up and says, I didn't do this for my covet. I did this to glorify the name of God. So you had to erase it or whatever, and so on. We're talking about a man that knows when Mashiach is coming. Could you imagine who this person is? And so on, the holiness of this person, right? So he says this refers to the Mashiach. You see? So we're talking about a person that knows very well what is going on here, and so on. In any case, that's what it says, that someday he will grow. What does that mean, he will grow? That means he's been subjected to terrible afflictions, and therefore he will finally succeed. That'll begin to tell you what's happened before. And I once said what this means, that the Mashiach ben Yosef himself, he will be exalted. So the Medrash asks, what does exalted mean? From who? He will be more exalted than Avram Avinu. He will be greater than Avram Avinu. Then the next thing, and he will become high, right? He will be greater than Moshe Rabbeinu. This is Mashiach ben Yosef, by the way. And exceedingly lofty, he will be greater than the Malachim. Wow, boy did he journey far, and so on. In other words, he comes from within the Klippa, being subjected to such horrible suffering, right? Abnormal suffering, but this is what he ends up with. You see, in fact, what is interesting, without going into Pratim, is that there's a Medrash, Yalkut Shimoni, that says that the Avos, Moshe Rabbeinu, Aaron HaKohen, Shmuel HaNavi, all of them come to the Mashiach ben Ephraim, he calls, that's Mashiach ben Yosef, and they say to him, you are greater than us, because you were soivel, unbelievable Yisurin, by being in the Klippa, by being in the house of the Sultan. And I mentioned what the challenges are. Greater than us. And it says that Ramchal is going to reward him with something which you cannot even imagine, so on. But this is what it says, that he will become this. But before that, he wasn't. But look what it says. You see, and then it says, and as multitudes were astonished over you, over who? Over the Mashiach. Multitudes were astonished over the Mashiach ben Yosef, saying that indeed his appearance, remember we're going to the Targum Yonason that it refers to Mashiach, indeed his appearance is too marred to be a man. It's terrible. This guy looks terrible. You see, that's what they're saying about the Mashiach. And his visage, his appearance, right, to be human. It can't even be human. What are they talking about? So then it says, so will the many nations, exclaim, and they're all shut up. So we can't believe this guy's the Mashiach ben Yosef. Are you kidding? You see, because they're seeing something they never saw. He's the last guy that anybody would think is a Mashiach. That's how bad his suffering is. You see, that's what it says, because we're referring now to the Targum Yonason that he's Mashiach. It could also apply to the Jewish people. Obviously, that's another way of learning it. The nations of the world cannot believe, with all this anti-Semitism and the thousands of years of torture and all that, you, Israel, are the chosen of God? We can't believe this. You're nothing. I don't want to repeat the words that they call, the Jewish people and so on, what they think of Jews and so on. But this refers to Mashiach ben Yosef, according to the Targum. So the question is, wait a minute, why does he look this way? That nobody would suspect. Why are they astonished at looking at this guy? You see? Because of what he went through. That's why. Clearly, that he's been involved in Chatoim. In fact, I want to tell you something. You know where you see this? When the brothers came to Egypt. I want to tell you this medrash. The brothers come to Egypt. You know what one of their kavanas is? To find Yosef. Right. Because they weren't in Egypt all the years since Yosef got, which is 13 years ago, kidnapped and all that. So one of the things they wanted to do is find Yosef. Do you know where they looked? In houses of prostitution. That's where they looked. Why? Because they knew nobody could survive the temptations of Egypt. Can't survive this. Egypt is a land filled with promiscuity, licentiousness and so on, Zima. So that's where they naturally looked for Yosef. That is one of the reasons, by the way, when they did see Yosef and he called them in, and that the whole episode, that you have to bring Binyamin and so on, they didn't recognize Yosef. Why? Because it's not only his appearance. I mean, you don't age that much in 13 years. And even if he had a beard, whatever it was, because their mental state was, this can't be Yosef. How can he be a kidnapped person that we're looking for in houses of prostitution, right? How can he wind up being the Grand Vizier? That is impossible. And that's why when Yosef reveals himself, what does he say? Ani Yosef, I'm Yosef. And they were shocked. Not only because he was alive, because how in the world did you survive the temptations of Egypt? Why are you not a Russia? You see? Why are you not like Esav? You can't survive Egypt in its tumah, especially as a slave and prison and so on. You're finished. Nobody could survive that and remain. So not only did you remain Ani Yosef, and what did that Ani Yosef? I'm the same Yosef that you sold, tzaddik. Even though you thought I was bad because I sinned, I spoke lashon hara about you, whatever, but I'm Yosef. They could not believe it. They were astonished that he was Yosef. And not only that he was the Grand Vizier, but that he survived, you see. Because you can't survive. That's a very important idea. And that's why these people are astonished at the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, and let me tell you one more story since it's this. Moshe Rabbeinu, there's a medrash that says the following. There was a king that heard about Egypt and what Moshe Rabbeinu did with Klal Yisrael. Okay? And there's a certain discipline called physiognomy. That means by the shape of your forehead and your skull. It's not really proven to be anything, but it's certainly a discipline that ancients used to have, that they could tell by your skull what your characteristic is and what your essence is. So this king, he was very curious. Moshe Rabbeinu, prophecy and all that, he must have an unbelievable face. So he sent an artist. I want you to draw. Please go to the Jews and ask Moshe Rabbeinu, I want you to draw. I wish we could have that picture, you know. And he drew Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe Rabbeinu allowed it, whatever. And he went back to the king. So these guys who know physiognomy, whatever it's called, and so on, they studied the picture. They said it's impossible to be Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because the face of this person is incredibly evil. Not only is it evil, terrible midas, terrible characteristics. And that can't be Moshe Rabbeinu. So the king said to the artist, don't do this again. Go back and draw his picture. He did, you see. But he took a look at Moshe Rabbeinu. And he said, Moshe Rabbeinu said, what are you doing this again for? He says, because they don't believe this is your picture. Because this is the picture of an evil person based on your shape of your forehead and all that. So Moshe Rabbeinu told him an incredible thing. And we begin to understand what it means to be in the Klippa. He says, yeah, that is who I am. I was born with that tendency, like Esav. I was born with a tendency to be a terrible person, a Baal Gaiva, a Baal Taiva, you name it, all right? And not only that, but I lived amongst all these people. But I worked on myself tremendously. What does that tell you? And therefore, my picture does not resemble who I am, because I changed my entire character structure, even though my facial structure remains the same. That's what it means to be Esav in the Klippa, you see, to be in a terrible situation with tremendous proclivities, tendencies, inclination to sin, and to be involved in sinning, and so on, and so on. And I've tried to demonstrate all of these incidents of what happens. So we now understand, very important, that the Mashiach ben Yosef has created a new form of avodah, and that is an avodah in the Klippa itself, in the environment and the home of the Satan himself, to be subject to the temptations of an abnormal Satan, you see. And it's not only Mashiach ben Yosef, it's also Mashiach ben David. And this pasuk also refers to Mashiach ben David. Both Mashiachim are subject to this, you see. And that's why people are astonished. How could you be the Messiah? And so on and so forth, you know. Anyway, so this basically concludes the ideas of the sufferings of the Mashiach ben Yosef. It's very interesting. But what's interesting is that it is so difficult to be in the klipa, into the environment of the Satan himself, that the Shekhinah has to follow the neshama of Yosef or the neshama of David, whatever, into it, or else he cannot survive, which is very, very interesting. But thank God it does. The Mashiach is also in the Shekhinah is in Galus, the divine presence in Galus, and therefore not only does he survive, but take a look at Yeshaya, he will succeed. And guess what? When he leaves, when Mashiach ben Yosef will leave the Klippa, which he will, because that's what it means, he will be exalted and so on, then guess what? All the Jewish people also will leave the Klippa, right? That is the great turnaround that we are waiting for. And that really is Moshe Rabbeinu, the equivalent, at the burning bush, right? That's when he left the Klippa, by the burning bush. You see? And you think it's incredible to go from what's called Bora Mikta, from a deep pit, Le'igru Rama, to a high roof in one shot. And by the way, now you understand, when Yosef left the Klippa, remember that? He interpreted, the guy with the wine said there's a guy in prison that can interpret your dream. Do you know that in one pasuk, that they took out Yosef, it's all described in one pasuk. They took him from the lowest position in Egypt, which is in prison, right? That's where he was. And he stood in front of Paroi and became Grand Vizier within one pasuk. How does that happen? Because you should know, that tells us that when the Mashiach ben Yosef does leave this environment, terrible, right? It will be keheref ayin, in one shot. In fact, it'll be so quick that the Mashiach himself doesn't know what hit him. Right. It'll be shocking. Can you imagine Yosef, he's in prison, and the next 2 hours, he's standing in front of Pharaoh, the greatest person in Egypt, and then he's made the Grand Vizier, second only to Pharaoh. Only God can do that. There is nothing in creation that can replicate that miracle. So, let's hope it happens certainly this year. Thank you.